The spring of 1876 brought rain like nobody in Montana Territory had ever seen before. Day after day, the clouds rolled in dark and heavy, dumping water on the land until the ground couldn't soak up another drop. Jack Morrison stood on the wooden porch of his ranch house watching the sky with worried eyes. He was a man in his mid-40s with rough hands and a face weathered by years of hard work under the sun. His ranch had been his whole world for the past 15 years. Every fence post and barn board built with his own two hands. The Yellowstone River, which normally ran a good 5 miles from his property, was now creeping closer with each passing hour. Jack had chosen this spot specifically because it was far enough from the water to be safe, but close enough to use for his cattle. Now that decision seemed like it might have been a mistake. The muddy water was spreading across the valley floor, swallowing up grassland and pushing against the edges of his property line. He pulled his coat tighter against the cold rain and stepped off the porch. His boots sank into the soft earth with every step, making sucking sounds as he walked toward the barn. The cattle were restless, sensing something was wrong. Their nervous lowing filled the air, mixing with the constant drum of rain on the roof. Jack knew he needed to move them to higher ground soon, maybe up to the ridge behind the house where the land rose up safe from the flooding. As he opened the barn door, a gust of wind nearly tore it from his hands. The storm was getting worse, not better. Jack grabbed a coil of rope from inside, thinking he might need it to lead the cattle through the rising water. He was about to head back out when he heard something strange. At first he thought it was just the wind playing tricks or maybe a bird crying out. But then he heard it again, clearer this time. It was a human voice. A child's voice, and it was screaming. Jack's heart jumped in his chest. He dropped the rope and ran toward the sound, his boots splashing through puddles and mud. The rain was coming down so hard now that he could barely see 20 feet in front of him. He wiped the water from his eyes and squinted toward the river. That's when he saw them. 2 small figures were clinging to a cottonwood tree that was half submerged in the middle of the raging water. The river had risen so fast and so high that it had swallowed up trees that used to stand on dry land. These boys, they couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, were hanging on for dear life to the branches of one of those trees. The water rushed past them with terrifying force, carrying broken branches, uprooted bushes, and all kinds of debris. Jack could see the current pulling at the boys' legs, trying to tear them away from their only anchor. Their small hands gripped the wet bark, but he could tell they were getting tired. They wouldn't be able to hold on much longer. Jack didn't stop to think about the danger. He didn't wonder where these boys had come from or how they'd ended up in the river. All he knew was that 2 children were about to die right in front of him, and he was the only person around who could do something about it. He ran back to where he'd dropped the rope and snatched it up. His mind was racing, trying to figure out the best way to reach them. The water was moving too fast to just swim straight out. He'd get swept away before he made it halfway. He needed something to anchor himself, something strong enough to hold against the current. There was a big oak tree near the riverbank, one of the old ones with roots that went deep into the earth. Jack ran to it, his fingers working quickly to tie one end of the rope around the thick trunk. He tested the knot twice, pulling hard to make sure it would hold. Then he wrapped the other end around his own waist, tying it tight enough that it wouldn't slip but loose enough that he could still breathe. The water was freezing cold. Jack knew that the moment his feet touched it. The river had come down from the mountains, fed by melting snow and spring storms, and it felt like liquid ice. He took a deep breath and pushed forward into the current. The force of the water hit him like a charging bull. His feet were swept out from under him immediately, and suddenly he was fighting just to keep his head above the surface. The rope around his waist went tight, and he felt it dig into his ribs as the current tried to carry him downstream. His arms pumped hard, pulling himself through the water inch by inch. The cold was already starting to numb his hands and feet. Jack gritted his teeth and kept swimming. He could see the boys ahead of him, maybe 30 feet away now. They had spotted him too, and their cries became more desperate. The older one was trying to hold on to his younger brother, who looked like he was about to lose his grip completely. A broken tree branch came rushing at Jack's head. He ducked under the water just in time, feeling it scrape across his back. When he came up gasping for air, he was closer to the cottonwood tree. Just a little bit farther. His muscles screamed in protest, his lungs burned from the cold, but he kept going. Finally, his hand touched the rough bark of the tree. He grabbed hold and pulled himself around to where the boys were clinging. The older boy's eyes were wide with terror, his whole body shaking from cold and fear. His lips had turned blue and his teeth were chattering so hard Jack could hear them over the roar of the water. Jack reached out and grabbed the boy by his shirt. The fabric was soaked and heavy, but he managed to get a good grip. He pulled the boy close and wrapped one arm around him, then began the long fight back to shore. The rope helped, giving him something to pull against, but the journey back was even harder than the trip out. The boy's extra weight made every movement twice as difficult. When his feet finally touched solid ground, Jack didn't even pause to catch his breath. He carried the boy up onto the bank and immediately turned back toward the water. The younger brother was still out there, and his small hands were slipping on the wet bark. Jack could see the panic in the child's face as he realized he was about to fall into the rushing current. Jack plunged back into the icy water for the second time. His body was already exhausted, his muscles weak from the cold and effort, but he forced himself forward. The rope was still tied around his waist and he used it to guide himself back to the tree. This time he moved faster, knowing exactly what to expect from the current. He reached the younger boy just as the child's hands gave out. Jack's arm shot out and caught him as he fell, pulling him tight against his chest. The boy was lighter than his brother, but he was also more panicked, thrashing and grabbing at Jack's coat. Jack held him firm and started back toward shore one more time. By the time he dragged both boys onto dry land, Jack's whole body was shaking from the cold. His fingers were so numb he could barely untie the rope from around his waist. But the boys were safe. They were alive. That was all that mattered. He looked down at them lying on the muddy ground, coughing up river water and crying. That's when he noticed their clothes. Even soaked and covered in mud, he could see that they were wearing buckskin decorated with beautiful beadwork. These weren't settler children. These were native boys, probably from one of the tribes that lived in the territory. Jack didn't care about any of that right now. He scooped up both boys, one in each arm, and started running toward his ranch house. They needed warmth and they needed it fast, or the cold would finish what the river had started. Jack kicked open the door to his ranch house and rushed inside with the two boys in his arms. Water streamed from their clothes and his own, leaving a trail across the wooden floor. But he didn't care about that now. He carried them straight to the fireplace and gently set them down on the rug in front of it. The fire had burned down to just embers while he was outside. Jack quickly threw on fresh logs and used the poker to stir up the coals. Within moments, flames began to lick at the new wood, and warmth started spreading through the room. But it wasn't enough. The boys were in bad shape. Both children lay curled up on the floor, their bodies shaking violently. Their lips were a scary shade of blue-purple and their skin looked almost gray. The younger boy's teeth chattered so hard that Jack worried he might bite his own tongue. They needed to get out of those wet clothes right away or they'd never warm up. Jack ran to his bedroom and grabbed every blanket he owned. He also pulled out some of his old shirts, the ones that were too worn for work but still good enough to sleep in. The shirts would be huge on these small boys, but at least they'd be dry. When he came back to the living room, he knelt down beside them. "Come on, boys," he said gently, even though he knew they probably couldn't understand English. "We need to get you out of these wet things." The older boy looked up at him with eyes full of fear and confusion. But he must have understood what Jack was trying to do because he started pulling at his own shirt with trembling fingers. Jack helped them both, carefully removing the soaked buckskin clothing and replacing it with his dry shirts. The garments hung on them like dresses, but they were warm. Once the boys were changed, Jack wrapped them both in thick blankets until they looked like little cocoons. He positioned them right in front of the fire, close enough to feel the heat, but not so close they'd get burned. Then he rushed to the kitchen. His pot of beef broth from yesterday's dinner was still sitting on the stove. Jack quickly reheated it, stirring it constantly to make sure it warmed up fast. The rich smell filled the small house. When it was hot enough, he poured 2 cups and brought them back to the boys. "Here," he said, crouching down and offering the cups. "Drink this. It'll help warm you up from the inside." The older boy took the cup with both hands, which were still shaking. He brought it to his lips and took a small sip, then a bigger one. The younger boy watched his brother and did the same. Jack could see some color starting to come back into their faces as they drank the warm broth. He sat down on the floor with them, just watching to make sure they were okay. Now that the immediate danger had passed, he had a chance to really look at these children. The older one might have been 9, maybe 10 years old. He had a serious face for such a young kid, with dark eyes that seemed too wise for his age. The younger brother was probably around 7. His face was rounder, softer, and even through his fear, Jack could see a spark of curiosity in his eyes. Their clothes, the ones Jack had carefully laid out near the fire to dry, were really something special. The buckskin had been worked until it was soft as butter, and the beadwork was incredibly detailed. Someone had spent hours creating those patterns, each tiny bead sewn on with love and skill. These boys came from a family that cared about them. That was clear. As the boys warmed up, they started talking to each other in their own language. The words were completely foreign to Jack, musical and flowing in a way that English never was. They spoke quickly, their voices rising and falling with emotion. The older boy kept pointing toward the river, then at the window where the sun was starting to set. He seemed agitated, worried about something. Jack tried to communicate with them using his hands. He pointed to himself and said slowly, "Jack." Then he pointed at them with a questioning look. The older boy seemed to understand. He placed his hand on his own chest and said something that sounded like Mapi. Then he touched his brother and said, "Chatan." Mapi and Chatan, Jack repeated, doing his best to say the names right. The boys both nodded, and for the first time the younger one smiled just a little bit. Jack pointed toward the river and made a gesture like someone falling into water. "You were in the river," he said, knowing they didn't understand but hoping his meaning was clear. "Where's your family?" "Your mother? Father?" At the word mother, both boys reacted strongly. Mapi, the older one, jumped to his feet despite still being wrapped in blankets. He pointed out the window urgently and spoke rapidly, his voice getting louder. He made gestures that Jack tried to follow, pointing at the setting sun, then holding up fingers, then pointing north. Jack understood they were trying to tell him something important, but he couldn't figure out what exactly. Were they saying their mother would come looking for them? Were they supposed to be somewhere by sunset? The frustration on Mapi's face showed that he was just as upset about not being able to communicate as Jack was. "I know, son," Jack said gently. "I wish I could understand you, but we'll figure this out." He thought about his options. The nearest fort, Fort Ellis, was about a day's ride from here. They had interpreters there, people who could speak both English and various tribal languages. If he took the boys there in the morning, they could help him find out where these children belonged and get them home safely. But that meant keeping them here overnight. Jack looked out the window at the darkening sky. The rain had finally stopped, but the river was still running high and dangerous. Even if the boys' family was out looking for them, they wouldn't be able to cross that water tonight. He made up his mind. The boys would stay here where it was warm and safe. Tomorrow, once the sun was up, he'd take them to the fort. It was the best plan he could come up with. Jack got up and went to the kitchen. He had some dried venison and hard bread, nothing fancy, but it was food. He also had a bit of honey that he'd traded for at the last settlement. He made simple sandwiches and brought them back to the boys along with cups of water. The children ate like they were starving, which they probably were after their ordeal in the river. Jack watched them and felt a strange ache in his chest. He'd wanted children of his own once, had imagined teaching a son to rope cattle and ride horses, but his wife had died bringing their daughter into the world, and the baby had died too. That was 12 years ago now, but sometimes the pain felt as fresh as yesterday. As night fell completely, Jack got up and started checking the doors and windows. He wasn't afraid of the boys, not at all, but he was worried about what might happen if someone came looking for them. Tensions between settlers and the native tribes had been building for months now. There had been fights, misunderstandings, people on both sides getting hurt or killed. If a war party came looking for these boys and found them in a white man's house, they might not stop to ask questions first. Jack didn't want trouble, but he also wasn't going to turn these children out into the cold night. He'd just have to hope that if anyone did come, they'd give him a chance to explain. He moved the boys to his bedroom, where they'd be more comfortable. They climbed into his big bed together, huddling close to each other under the pile of blankets. Their eyes were already drooping with exhaustion. Going through what they'd experienced would tire anyone out, let alone small children. "Sleep now," Jack said softly. "You're safe here. I promise." Even though they didn't understand his words, something in his tone must have reassured them. Chatan, the younger boy, closed his eyes first. Mapi stayed awake a bit longer, watching Jack with those serious eyes. But eventually, he too drifted off to sleep. Jack left the bedroom door open a crack so he could hear if they needed anything. Then he settled into his chair by the fire, his rifle across his lap. He told himself he was just being cautious, that probably nothing would happen. But as the hours passed and midnight approached, he couldn't shake the feeling that this night was far from over. He was right to be worried. Around midnight he heard it, the sound that would make his blood run cold, the thunder of hoofbeats, dozens of them, coming fast toward his ranch. Jack stood up and moved to the window, and what he saw there made his heart nearly stop. Warriors. At least 100 of them, maybe more. They surrounded his house in a perfect circle, their horses stamping and snorting in the darkness. And at the front of them all sat a woman who looked like she could command the very earth itself to move. After Jack had brought the two boys inside and gotten them warm and dry, he sat with them by the fireplace trying to figure out what to do next. The children huddled together on the floor, wrapped in blankets that were far too big for their small frames. They looked like two little birds in a nest, pressed close together for comfort and safety. The boys talked to each other constantly in their native language. The words flowed between them like music, full of sounds that Jack had never heard before. Sometimes they spoke softly, almost whispering, and other times their voices rose with what seemed like urgency or worry. Jack wished more than anything that he could understand what they were saying. He tried his best to communicate with them, using his hands and simple gestures. When he wanted to offer them more broth, he pretended to drink from a cup. When he wanted to know if they were cold, he wrapped his arms around himself and shivered. The boys seemed to understand some of what he was trying to say, and they nodded or shook their heads in response. But there was something they were trying to tell him, something important, and Jack just couldn't figure it out. Mapi, the older boy, kept standing up and walking to the window. He'd point outside at the sky, which had finally stopped raining. Then he'd point at where the sun had been before it set. He'd hold up his fingers, counting something, though Jack couldn't tell if he meant hours or days or something else entirely. Each time Mapi did this, his face grew more worried. His eyebrows would scrunch together, and he'd speak faster and louder to his younger brother. Chatan would nod seriously, like he understood exactly what Mapi was concerned about. Then they'd both look at Jack with pleading eyes, as if willing him to understand through sheer desperation. Jack pulled out the few native words he knew from his memory. Over the years, he'd been to trading posts where people from different tribes came to exchange furs and goods. He'd picked up maybe a dozen words total, just basic things. He tried them all now, pointing at different things around the room. Water, fire, food. But none of these seemed to be what the boys were trying to communicate. At one point, Mapi grabbed Jack's hand and tried to pull him toward the door. The boy was clearly wanting Jack to go somewhere with him, or maybe wanting to leave himself. But Jack gently held him back. "No, son," he said softly. "It's not safe out there. The river's still too high and it's dark now. We'll sort this out in the morning." The frustration on Mapi's face was heartbreaking to see. He was just a child, but he was trying so hard to be brave and take care of his younger brother. Jack could see that responsibility weighing on him. The boy's jaw was set with determination, even as worry flickered in his dark eyes. Jack brought them more food, hoping that would help calm their nerves. He found some dried berries he'd stored away and offered those too. The boys ate, but Mapi kept glancing at the window every few minutes. He was watching the sky, Jack realized, watching the light fade and the stars come out. As the evening wore on, Jack tried a different approach. He brought out paper and a pencil, thinking maybe the boys could draw what they were trying to explain. Mapi took the pencil eagerly and began sketching on the paper. His drawing skills weren't perfect, he was just a child after all, but Jack could make out some shapes. There was what looked like the river, and two stick figures that must have been the boys. Then Mapi drew a larger figure nearby, and around that figure he drew many, many more smaller figures. Jack studied the drawing carefully. Was Mapi trying to show him their family, their tribe? The large figure in the middle, was that their mother or father? And all those other figures around it, were those other people who would be looking for the boys? "Your family?" Jack asked, pointing to the drawing. "They're looking for you?" Mapi nodded so vigorously that his whole body moved. Yes, that was it. His family was looking for them. They would be coming. Jack felt his stomach tighten with worry. Of course, the boys' family would be searching for them. If they'd been gone since the river swept them away that morning, their parents must be frantic by now. But how would they find them here? And more importantly, when they did find them, would they understand that Jack had saved the boys, not harmed them? He'd heard stories about misunderstandings between settlers and native people, situations that had ended badly because nobody could communicate clearly. Jack made a decision. In the morning, he would take the boys to Fort Ellis. It was about a day's ride, maybe less if they moved quickly. At the fort, there were men who spoke multiple languages, people who worked as translators and peacekeepers. They could help him explain what had happened and get the boys back to their family safely. It was the best solution he could think of. He tried to explain this plan to Moppy using gestures. He pointed at the boys, then at himself, then made a riding motion like being on a horse. He pointed at the sun and made an arc across the sky to show tomorrow, but Moppy shook his head frantically. He pointed out the window at the dark sky and held up one finger. One what? One night? Was he trying to say someone would come tonight? A chill ran down Jack's spine. He looked out the window at the darkness. The rain had stopped, but the night was pitch black with clouds covering most of the stars. If people were out there searching in this, they were desperate, and desperate people could be dangerous, especially if they thought their children were in trouble. Jack walked around his small ranch house, checking every window and door. He wasn't sure exactly what he was preparing for, but he felt like something was coming. The boys watched him with wide eyes, and he tried to give them a reassuring smile. "It's okay," he told them, even though he wasn't sure that was true. "Everything's going to be okay." He made sure the fire was built up high so the house stayed warm. He checked that his rifle was loaded and nearby, not because he wanted to use it, but because he believed in being prepared. Then he tried to get the boys to go to sleep. They needed rest after the terrible day they'd had. He led them to his bedroom and pulled back the covers on his bed. It was the only real bed in the house, big enough for both boys to sleep comfortably. They climbed in together, still wrapped in their blankets, and huddled close to each other. Jack could tell they were exhausted, but they were also scared and worried. "Your family will find you," Jack said quietly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I promise. And when they do, I'll make sure they know you're safe. I'll make them understand somehow." Moppy looked at him with those two wise eyes. The boy might not have understood Jack's exact words, but he seemed to understand the meaning behind them. He nodded slightly and said something in his own language, his voice soft and serious. Chetan, the younger boy, was already falling asleep. His eyes kept closing, then opening again as he tried to fight off exhaustion. Finally, his breathing deepened and evened out, and he was truly asleep. Moppy lasted a bit longer, but eventually he too drifted off. Jack sat there for a few more minutes, watching them sleep. They looked so small and vulnerable in his big bed. He thought about their mother somewhere out there in the dark, probably terrified about what had happened to her children. He hoped she would find them soon. He hoped even more that when she did, there wouldn't be violence or bloodshed. He left the bedroom door open a crack so he could hear if the boys woke up or needed anything. Then he went back to the main room and settled into his old wooden chair near the fireplace. He laid his rifle across his lap, not pointing at anything, just ready. His eyes kept drifting to the windows, watching the darkness outside. The house was quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of wood settling. Outside, he could hear the distant rush of the still swollen river. But there was something else too, a feeling in the air. Like the moment before a thunderstorm hits, when everything goes still and waiting. Jack wasn't a man who believed in supernatural things, but he trusted his instincts. Those instincts had kept him alive through harsh winters, dangerous work with cattle, and the general hardships of frontier life. And right now, those instincts were telling him that this night wasn't going to pass peacefully. He didn't have to wait long to be proven right. Around midnight, when the darkness was deepest and most complete, he heard them. Horses. Lots of horses. The sound of hoofbeats carried clearly through the still night air, growing louder by the second. Jack stood up from his chair, his heart beginning to pound in his chest. He moved to the window and looked out into the darkness. At first he couldn't see anything. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he began to make out shapes moving in the night. Riders, dozens of them, no more than dozens. There had to be at least 100 mounted warriors surrounding his property. They came like ghosts out of the darkness, forming a perfect circle around his ranch house. Jack could see them more clearly now as they drew closer. Their faces were painted, He could see the pale markings even in the dim light. They carried weapons, bows and arrows, rifles, spears. This was a war party, organized and ready for battle. And at the very front of this terrifying force sat a woman. Even from a distance, even in the darkness, Jack could feel the power radiating from her. She sat on her horse with the bearing of someone who commanded respect and obedience. The sound of 100 horses surrounding his property was unlike anything Jack had ever heard before. The ground actually seemed to vibrate beneath his feet from the thunder of hooves. His heart hammered in his chest so hard he thought it might break right through his ribs. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to grab his rifle and barricade the door. But another part of him, the part that had pulled 2 drowning boys from a raging river just hours before, knew that violence wasn't the answer here. Jack pressed his face close to the window, trying to see everything clearly in the darkness. The warriors had formed a complete circle around his ranch house, blocking every possible escape route. Their horses stamped and snorted, clouds of breath visible in the cold night air. The riders sat perfectly still on their mounts like statues carved from stone. It was the kind of discipline that came from years of training and absolute trust in their leader. And that leader, the woman at the front of the formation, was the most intimidating person Jack had ever laid eyes on. She sat tall and proud on a paint horse that was marked with the same war symbols that decorated her face. Even from a distance, Jack could see the white and red streaks across her cheeks and forehead. Her clothing was made of the finest buckskin, decorated with beadwork and feathers that marked her status. This wasn't just any warrior. This was a chief, a leader of her people. Her face was set like stone, showing no emotion except for her eyes. Even in the dim moonlight that occasionally broke through the clouds, Jack could see the fury burning in those eyes. But underneath that fury was something else, something that made his chest ache with sympathy. It was fear. The raw, desperate fear of a mother who thinks her children might be hurt or worse. Jack's hands were shaking as he stood there at the window. He'd faced down charging bulls, fought off wolves attacking his herd, and survived winters that killed weaker men. But this was different. This was 100 trained warriors who believed he might have harmed their chief's children. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and he'd be dead before he could even try to explain. Behind him, he heard a sound from the bedroom. Then came the patter of small feet running across the wooden floor. Moppy burst into the room, his eyes wide and alert. The boy must have been a light sleeper, woken by the sound of the horses. He ran straight to the window next to Jack and looked out. When he saw what was outside, his whole face changed. The worry and fear that had been there before was replaced with pure relief and excitement. "Ina!" he shouted, pressing his hands against the glass. It was the first word Jack had heard from the boy that he could even try to remember. "Ina, Ina!" The boy was practically bouncing with joy now. Chatan came running out of the bedroom too, rubbing sleep from his eyes. When Moppy grabbed him and pointed out the window, the younger boy's face lit up just like his brother's. "Ina!" he cried out too. Both boys were trying to get to the door now, pulling at Jack's arms, pointing outside. Jack's mind was racing. The boys clearly knew the woman outside. They were happy to see her, not afraid. And that word they kept saying, Ina, it had to mean mother. This was their mother outside, and she'd brought what looked like half her tribe to get them back. But here's what terrified Jack. Those warriors didn't know their chief's sons were safe and happy inside. For all they knew, a white settler had taken the boys, maybe hurt them. The woman's face, painted for war, showed exactly what she thought might have happened. She was ready to tear down this ranch house board by board to find her children. She was ready to kill anyone who stood in her way. Jack had maybe seconds to make a decision that would either save his life or end it. He could keep the boys inside, try to barricade the door, and hope to explain through the walls. But that would look like he was holding them hostage. The warriors would attack and everyone would die, including the boys caught in the crossfire. Or he could do something that went against every survival instinct he had. He could open that door, walk outside unarmed, and trust that a mother's love for her children was stronger than her rage. His hands moved before his brain could talk him out of it. He reached for the heavy wooden bolt that locked his front door. The metal was cold under his fingers as he slid it free. Moppy and Chatan were jumping up and down now, understanding what he was about to do. "Okay, boys," Jack said, his voice shaking slightly. "Okay, let's get you back to your mother." He pulled the door open and the cold night air rushed into the warm house. Every single warrior outside shifted on their horses. Jack heard the creak of bowstrings being drawn tighter, saw rifles being raised to shoulders. They were ready to fire, just waiting for their chief to give the command. Jack raised both his hands high in the air, showing he was unarmed. It was the universal sign of surrender, of peace. He hoped it meant the same thing to these warriors as it did to him. Then he stepped outside onto his porch, his heart pounding so hard he felt dizzy. For a moment, absolutely nothing happened. The world seemed frozen in time. Jack stood there with his hands up, facing down 100 warriors in the darkness. The woman on the paint horse stared at him with eyes that burned with barely controlled rage. Her hand was on the knife at her belt, and Jack knew she could throw it and hit him right in the heart before he could even blink. Then, like two small thunderbolts, Mapi and Chatan burst through the door behind him. They ran past Jack so fast he felt the breeze from their movement. "Aina! Aina!" they screamed, their voices full of joy and relief. They ran straight toward that circle of warriors, their small legs pumping as fast as they could go. The change in the woman was instant and dramatic. The stone face cracked. The fury in her eyes transformed into shock, then desperate hope. She threw her leg over her horse and slid off before the animal had even fully stopped. She hit the ground running, her moccasins barely touching the earth as she raced toward her sons. The three of them collided in the middle of the yard, and the woman dropped to her knees, pulling both boys into her arms. Jack could hear her voice now, speaking rapidly in her language, and even though he didn't understand the words, he understood everything. She was checking them for injuries, her hands running over their heads and arms and bodies. She was holding them so tight it must have hurt, but the boys didn't complain. They wrapped their small arms around her neck and clung to her like they'd never let go. But even in that moment of reunion, even with tears streaming down her face, the woman never took her eyes off Jack. She watched him over her sons' heads, and her expression was complex, a mixture of relief and suspicion and confusion. She spoke to Mapi, asking him something, and the boy pulled back and started talking rapidly, gesturing wildly with his hands. Every single warrior in that circle was still ready to attack. Their weapons were still drawn, still pointed in Jack's general direction. The only thing keeping them from charging was their chief, and she was clearly trying to understand what had happened. Jack stood perfectly still on his porch, his hands still raised, barely breathing. One wrong word from the woman, one signal, and this would all be over. Mapi was acting out something now, and it took Jack a moment to realize the boy was showing his mother what had happened at the river. He pretended to swim, to grab onto something, to be pulled by the current. Then he pointed at Jack and made pulling motions like someone hauling on a rope. Chatan joined in, both boys talking over each other in their excitement to tell the story. The woman's face was changing as she listened. The suspicion in her eyes was slowly being replaced by something else. She asked more questions, and Mapi answered them all, his young voice urgent and sincere. He grabbed his mother's hand and pulled her toward the house, pointing at the door, then at Jack, then back at the door again. She stood slowly, and for the first time, she spoke to the warriors behind her. Her voice rang out clear and strong in the night air, giving commands in her language. Instantly, every weapon was lowered. Not put away, Jack noticed, but lowered. The warriors were still ready to act if needed, but the immediate threat had passed. It was like watching 100 coiled springs relax just slightly. The woman walked toward Jack, her sons pressed close to her sides. She moved with the grace of someone who'd spent her whole life on horseback and in the wilderness. Every step was deliberate, measured. When she got close enough, Jack could see her face more clearly. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe in her early 30s, but her eyes held the kind of knowledge and pain that aged a person beyond their years. She stopped about 10 feet away from his porch and studied him carefully. Her gaze was so intense that Jack felt like she was seeing right through him, reading every thought in his head. He kept his hands raised, not wanting to make any sudden movements that might be misinterpreted. Then, slowly and deliberately, the woman placed her hand over her heart. She held it there for a moment, her eyes locked on Jack's. Then she extended that hand toward him, palm up, in a gesture that seemed to transcend language. It was a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, maybe even of thanks. Jack slowly lowered his hands and returned the gesture, placing his own hand over his heart before extending it toward her. He didn't know if he was doing it right, but he hoped she would understand that he meant no harm, that he only wanted to help. The woman stood before Jack on his porch, her two sons pressed against her sides like they were afraid she might disappear if they let go. Even now, even after the immediate danger had passed, Jack's heart was still racing. He could feel sweat running down his back, despite the cold night air. He'd just faced down certain death and somehow survived. The woman spoke to her sons, her voice gentle but firm. She was asking them questions, and they answered eagerly, both boys talking at once sometimes. Jack watched as Moppy used his hands to act out the whole story again, more detailed this time. The boy pretended to fall into water, to struggle against the current to hold onto a tree branch. His small hands gripped invisible bark, and his face showed the terror he must have felt. Then Moppy pointed at Jack and made the motion of throwing a rope. He acted out being pulled through the water, being carried to shore, being brought into the warm house. Chetan jumped in to add details, pulling at his mother's sleeve and pointing at the house, then at Jack, then back at the house. He was showing her how Jack had given them dry clothes and hot food. The woman listened to every word, her dark eyes never leaving her sons' faces. But Jack noticed that even while she was focused on them, she kept glancing back at him, studying him like she was trying to figure out a puzzle. What kind of man was he? What had motivated him to risk his life for children who weren't his own, who came from people often seen as enemies? When the boys finished their story, the woman straightened up. She said something to them in a firm voice, and both boys nodded seriously. Then she gently pushed them toward the house. "Go," she seemed to be saying, though Jack couldn't understand the actual words. The boys looked between their mother and Jack, then slowly walked back toward the porch, though they kept turning around to look at her. Now it was just Jack and the woman, standing in the yard with 100 warriors watching from the circle they'd formed around the property. The older warrior, who spoke English, had dismounted and was standing nearby, ready to translate if needed. The woman took a few steps closer to Jack, close enough now that he could see her face clearly in the moonlight. She was beautiful, he realized, but in a fierce way. Her features were strong and proud, her jawline sharp, her eyes intense. This was a person who'd been tested by life and had refused to break. The war paint on her face, which had seemed so terrifying before, now looked like symbols of protection and power. She studied Jack just as carefully as he was studying her. Her gaze traveled from his face down to his hands, which were rough and scarred from years of hard work. She looked at his clothes, simple and worn but clean. She looked at his house, small and humble but well-maintained. Jack had the strange feeling that she was reading his entire life story just from these small details. Then she spoke, her voice strong and clear. The warrior translated immediately. "She wants you to know her name. She is called Akecheta. It means fighter in your tongue." "Akecheta," Jack repeated, trying his best to pronounce it correctly. He placed his hand over his heart again, and then gestured to himself. "Jack Morrison." Akecheta nodded slightly, acknowledging his name. Then she spoke again, longer this time, her words flowing like water. The warrior listened carefully before translating. "She says she has been tracking her son since the sun was high in the sky. They were crossing the river on their way back from a hunting lesson when the water took them. She searched along the banks for hours, calling their names, finding nothing but pieces of their belongings caught in the brush." Jack felt his chest tighten as he imagined what that must have been like. Hours of searching, finding scraps of clothing but no children. The terror, the desperation, the horrible possibilities that must have run through her mind. The warrior continued translating. When darkness fell and she still had not found them, she feared the worst. She gathered her warriors and prepared to search through the night. She was ready to tear apart the earth itself to find her sons. When the tracks led here to a white man's ranch, she thought. The warrior paused, seeming uncomfortable with what he had to say next. "She thought you had taken them. Or worse." Jack swallowed hard. He'd been right about how close to death he'd come. If those boys hadn't run out when they did, if they hadn't shown their mother that they were safe and happy, he would have been killed before he could say a word in his own defense. Akecheta spoke again, and this time her voice was softer. The warrior translated. "She says she was wrong about you. She says her sons have told her what you did, how you risked your life to save theirs. She says you asked for nothing in return, expected no reward. You simply did what was right because it was right. Any decent person would have done the same. Jack said quietly. When this was translated, Akacheta shook her head firmly and spoke again. She says no, the warrior translated. She says many white men would have let her sons drown. Many would have been too afraid or too hateful. She says you are different. There was a long pause then, filled only with the sounds of the night and the quiet movements of the warriors making camp. Jack didn't know what to say. He'd never thought of himself as special or particularly brave. He'd just seen children in danger and acted without thinking. Akacheta reached down to her wrist where she wore a leather band decorated with intricate beadwork. She untied it carefully and held it in her hands for a moment, looking at it like it held precious memories. Then she stepped forward and held it out to Jack. This belonged to her husband, the warrior translated, his voice taking on a more serious tone. He died 2 winters ago, taken by the sickness that swept through their camp. This is one of the few things she has left of him. She wants you to have it. Jack's eyes widened. I can't take that, he said immediately. It's too important. It means too much. But Akacheta insisted, speaking firmly and pushing the band toward him. The warrior translated. She says you must take it. In our culture, when someone saves a life, especially the life of a child, a bond is formed. A debt is created. This band will mark you as family. Any Crow warrior who sees it will know you are under our protection. You will be safe in our territory. You will be welcome in our camps. Jack reached out slowly and took the leather band. It was soft and warm from being worn against Akacheta's skin. The beadwork was beautiful, each tiny bead sewn on with incredible skill. He could see how much this piece meant to her, and the fact that she was giving it to him made his throat tight with emotion. Thank you, he said, his voice rough. I'll treasure this, and I'll honor what it represents. Akacheta nodded, satisfied. Then she spoke again, at length this time, her voice taking on a formal quality. The warrior translated carefully. She says that from this night forward, you are under the protection of the Crow Nation. Her warriors will watch over your ranch. Any who come to harm you, whether white or native, will face her justice. This is her oath, spoken before her people as a witness. Jack looked around at the circle of warriors. They were all watching this exchange, and he could see understanding on their faces. They knew what their chief had just promised, and they would honor it. He was safer now than he'd ever been in his life, protected by one of the most powerful leaders in the territory. I don't know what to say, Jack admitted. It's more than I ever expected. She says no words are needed, the warrior translated. She says you have already spoken through your actions. You saved her sons when you could have let them die. You gave them shelter when you could have turned them away. You returned them, unharmed when you could have used them for your own purposes. These actions speak louder than any words. Akacheta called out something to her warriors then, and they responded immediately. Some began setting up small camps around the property. Others tended to the horses. A few started building fires, small, controlled flames that would provide warmth without being wasteful. They moved with practiced efficiency, like they'd done this 1,000 times before. She and her warriors will camp here tonight, the warrior explained. They will leave when the sun rises, but until then they will guard your property and ensure your safety. It is her way of returning the protection you gave her sons. Jack nodded, understanding. Akacheta called to Mapi and Chatan, who had been watching from the porch. They came running back to their mother, and she knelt down to their level, speaking to them gently. She hugged them both again, holding them close for a long moment. Then she looked up at Jack and spoke. She says she will never forget what you did today, the warrior translated. She says her sons will never forget. When they are grown men, they will tell their children about the white rancher who saved them from the river. Your name will be remembered with honor among our people. Jack felt his eyes getting wet and he blinked quickly. It was my privilege to help them, he said. They're good boys, brave boys. When this was translated, Akacheta smiled for the first time. It transformed her face, softening the hard edges and showing the mother beneath the warrior chief. She spoke to her sons and they both grinned and waved at Jack. The rest of the night passed in a way Jack never could have imagined. The warriors settled into their camps, but there was no sense of threat or danger anymore. The tension had dissolved completely, replaced by something almost peaceful. As Jack sat by the fire with Akecheta and her warriors, he kept expecting to wake up and find this was all some strange dream. Just that morning, he'd been a lonely rancher worried about flooding. Now he was sitting among Crow warriors wearing a leather band that marked him as family, under the protection of a powerful chief. Life could change in the most unexpected ways. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the dark sky. More warriors had gathered around now, curious about this white man their chief had chosen to honor. Some of them looked at Jack with open suspicion, their faces hard and unfriendly. They'd probably lost friends or family to white settlers over the years. Jack couldn't blame them for their distrust, but they stayed quiet and respectful, following their chief's lead. Akecheta noticed their stares and spoke to them in a voice that commanded instant attention. Her words were sharp and firm, carrying the weight of authority. Whatever she said made several of the warriors nod and lower their eyes. The translator leaned over to Jack and explained quietly, "She reminds them that you saved her sons. She says any disrespect to you is disrespect to her." They understand now. The mood shifted after that. The warriors didn't suddenly become friendly, but the open hostility faded. One of them even offered Jack a piece of dried meat, which he accepted gratefully. It was different from anything he'd tasted before, seasoned with herbs he didn't recognize, but it was good. As the night wore on, Akecheta continued to share her story through the translator. She told Jack about her people's struggles, their efforts to hold onto their traditional lands as more and more settlers moved into the territory. She spoke of councils with other tribes, alliances formed and broken, the constant pressure to adapt or be destroyed. "My people have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted," she said, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "We know every hill, every river, every place where the buffalo gather. This is not just land to us. It is our mother, our provider, our home. When settlers come and claim it as their own, they do not understand what they are taking." Jack listened carefully. He'd never thought about it quite that way before. To him, land was something you could claim and own, something you could buy and build on. But hearing Akecheta speak, he began to understand a different perspective. To her people, the land wasn't property. It was family. "I built my ranch because I wanted a place to call my own," Jack said honestly when she finished. "I wanted somewhere to belong. I guess we're not so different in that way. We both want a home. We both want to protect what matters to us." The translator conveyed this to Akecheta, and she studied Jack's face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Yes," she said through the translator. "Perhaps we are not so different. Perhaps if more people understood this, there would be less blood spilled." She paused, then spoke again with more intensity. "But you must understand something, Jack Morrison. The protection I offer you tonight is not just empty words. It is a sacred oath. In our culture, when such a promise is made before witnesses, it binds not just me but all my people. My warriors here, they heard my words. They will honor them as if they were their own promises." The translator continued, "She wants you to know what this means. If anyone, white or native, tries to harm you, her warriors will defend you as they would defend her own family. If your ranch is threatened, they will fight to protect it. If you are in danger, they will come to your aid. This is not a small thing she offers you. This is a bond that will last your lifetime." Jack felt the weight of those words settle over him like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about gratitude for saving the boys. This was about honor, about responsibility, about connections that went deeper than he'd ever experienced. "I don't know how to repay such a gift," he said quietly. Akecheta smiled slightly when this was translated. She reached over and placed her hand briefly on Jack's shoulder, a gesture that made several warriors' eyes widen in surprise. Then she spoke, and the translator said, "She says you already repaid it. You gave her back her sons. You gave her back her future. There is no greater gift than that. What she offers now is not payment but recognition. You are worthy of honor, and so you will be honored." Mapi and Chatan stirred in their sleep, and Akecheta's attention immediately went to them. She adjusted the blanket around them, her touch gentle and careful. When she looked back at Jack, there was such fierce love in her eyes that it almost hurt to see. "My husband was killed by sickness," she said through the translator, her voice dropping lower. "But before that he was killed by hatred. The sickness came from white men's diseases, brought to our camps through trade. We had no defense against it. It swept through our people like wildfire, taking the old, the young, the strong, and the weak. It did not care who it killed. She paused, looking into the fire. I watched my husband waste away over many days. He was a strong man, a great warrior, but this enemy he could not fight. When he died, I wanted to rage against all white people. I wanted revenge for what had been taken from me. But then I had to think of my sons. What kind of world was I creating for them if I taught them only hatred? I am so sorry, Jack said, and he meant it deeply. I can't imagine that kind of pain. No, Akecheta agreed when she heard the translation. Unless you have lived it, you cannot imagine. But pain is something all people understand, whether white or native. You lost your wife and child? I lost my husband. We both know what it means to have our hearts broken. Perhaps this is why the spirits brought us together tonight, so we could see that our grief is the same, even if our skin is different. They sat in silence for a while after that, both lost in their own memories. Around them, the warriors settled in for the night. Some slept, others kept watch, rotating positions so there were always fresh eyes scanning the darkness. They were protecting their chief and her sons, but Jack realized they were also protecting him now. He was part of their circle, strange as that seemed. As the night grew late and the fire burned lower, Akecheta spoke one more time. Her words were formal and ceremonial, and she gestured for the translator and several senior warriors to come closer. They formed a small circle around the fire, and Jack instinctively understood that something important was about to happen. Jack Morrison, Akecheta said through the translator, her voice carrying authority and power. Before these witnesses, I declare you a friend to the Crow people. The band on your wrist marks this truth, but more than that, I declare you as family. My sons call you the man who saved them. I call you brother. Any Crow who sees you will know these things and act accordingly. She paused, then continued. I also make this promise. Your ranch and your property are under my protection. I will send scouts to watch over this land. If danger comes, you will be warned. If enemies attack, we will defend you. This is my word, and my word is law among my people. The warriors around the circle nodded solemnly. One of them, an older man with scars across his chest, spoke up in English. We hear the chief's words, he said, his voice gravelly. We will honor them. The white rancher is under our protection now. Jack looked around at these faces, warriors who'd been ready to kill him just hours ago, now pledging to protect him. It was overwhelming. I don't deserve this honor, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But I swear I'll try to be worthy of it. I'll never betray your trust. I'll never harm your people. And if you ever need help, if there's ever anything I can do in return, you just have to ask. When this was translated, several of the warriors smiled for the first time. One of them said something that made the others chuckle, and the translator explained. He says you speak like a Crow warrior. He says maybe you have native blood you don't know about. The tension that had been present all night finally broke completely. The atmosphere around the fire became almost relaxed. Warriors started talking among themselves, sharing their own stories. Some of them even began to ask Jack questions through the translator, curious about this white man their chief had chosen to honor. They wanted to know about his ranch, his cattle, his life. Jack answered as best he could, finding common ground in talk of horses and weather and the challenges of surviving in harsh territory. One young warrior, not much older than Mapi, seemed particularly interested in Jack's descriptions of roping cattle. He made gestures showing how he captured wild horses, and Jack recognized the similarity in their techniques. As dawn began to color the eastern sky, Akecheta finally rose to her feet. Her sons woke up immediately, alert in the way of children who'd grown up in uncertain times. She spoke to them softly and they nodded, then came over to Jack. Through a combination of gestures and simple words, the boys said goodbye. Mapi, the older one, placed his small hand over his heart just like his mother had done, then extended it toward Jack. Chetan did the same, his young face serious with the importance of the moment. Jack returned the gesture, feeling his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Akecheta called out orders and her warriors began breaking camp with impressive speed. Within minutes, it was like they'd never been there. The fires were doused, the temporary shelters packed away, the horses saddled and ready. These people knew how to move quickly when needed. The campfires had burned steadily through the night, and as the hours passed, something remarkable began to happen. The rigid formality that had marked the early evening started to melt away like snow in spring sun. Warriors who'd been standing at attention began to relax. Conversations started flowing more freely, and most surprising of all, Jack found himself drawn deeper into their circle, rather than remaining an outsider looking in. It started when one of the younger warriors began acting out a story. He jumped to his feet near the fire and started moving dramatically, clearly describing a hunt or battle. The other warriors watched with grins on their faces, occasionally calling out what sounded like teasing comments. Even without understanding the language, Jack could tell this was a story they'd all heard before, probably exaggerated with each telling. Akecheta watched her warrior perform with an expression of amused tolerance. When he finished with a dramatic flourish, she said something that made all the others laugh, including the storyteller himself. The translator leaned over to Jack and explained, "She says he tells the story of how he caught the great elk, but each time he tells it, the elk gets bigger, and he gets braver. She says soon the elk will be the size of a mountain and he will claim he caught it with his bare hands." Jack couldn't help but chuckle. That was something he understood completely. He'd heard plenty of ranchers tell fish stories that grew with each retelling. It seemed bragging and exaggeration weren't limited to any one group of people. Emboldened by the lighter atmosphere, Jack decided to share one of his own stories. Through the translator, he told them about the time he'd tried to rope a particularly stubborn bull that had been terrorizing his other cattle. "I'd been chasing this bull for 3 days," Jack said, using his hands to act out the story. "Every time I got close, he'd charge at me instead of running away. Finally, on the 3rd day, I managed to get my rope around his horns, but I'd forgotten one very important thing." He paused for effect and saw that he had everyone's attention. Even warriors who didn't speak English were watching closely, reading his gestures. "I forgot that my horse was afraid of this particular bull. The second my rope caught, my horse panicked and took off running in the opposite direction. The bull pulled one way, my horse pulled the other, and I was stuck in the middle, hanging on for dear life." The translator was working quickly now, conveying Jack's words, and he could see understanding dawn on the warriors' faces. Several of them started to smile. "I held on as long as I could," Jack continued, "but eventually the rope slipped and I went flying through the air. I landed right in the middle of the muddiest part of my cattle pen." The bull stood there looking at me like I was the stupidest creature he'd ever seen. And you know what? He was probably right. When the translation was complete, the camp erupted in laughter. Warriors slapped their knees and elbowed each other, clearly appreciating the image of this white rancher covered in mud and outsmarted by a bull. Even Akecheta laughed, a genuine, warm sound that transformed her entire face. One of the older warriors spoke up, and through the translator, Jack learned he was sharing his own story of a hunting mishap involving a rabbit that had somehow managed to trip him into a stream. The stories flowed after that, one after another, each person trying to top the last with tales of mistakes and misadventures. It turned out that embarrassing moments were universal, regardless of language or culture. As the night deepened and the stories continued, Akecheta gestured for the translator to sit closer to her and Jack. She wanted to talk more seriously now, to share things that required careful translation. Her sons were asleep against her, their breathing deep and even, and she stroked their hair absently as she spoke. "I want you to understand what it means to lead my people," she said, her voice low and intense. "Every decision I make affects not just me, but hundreds of others. When I choose to go to war, warriors may die. When I choose peace, we may lose our hunting grounds. There is no choice that is easy, no path that is clear." Jack listened carefully, hearing the weight of responsibility in her words. "I became war chief not because I sought power," she continued, "but because I had earned respect through my actions. I fought beside my husband in many battles. I learned strategy from my father, who was chief before me. When my husband died and my people needed a leader, they chose me. Some questioned whether a woman could lead warriors into battle. I proved them wrong." She paused, looking into the fire with eyes that had seen too much violence and loss. "I have led my people through attacks by rival tribes and conflicts with settlers. I have made alliances that saved lives and enemies that threaten us still. And through it all, I have tried to remember that every person, whether friend or foe, is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's love." "That must be incredibly difficult," Jack said quietly, "making those kinds of decisions, knowing lives hang in the balance." Akecheta nodded when this was translated. Yes, the hardest part is knowing that sometimes there are no good choices. Sometimes you must choose between bad and worse. Sometimes people die no matter what you decide. But you must still choose. You must still lead. That is the burden of the leader. She looked down at her sleeping sons and her expression softened completely. But when my sons were swept away by the river, none of that mattered. I was not a war chief. I was not a leader of warriors. I was just a mother who had lost her children. In that moment, all my strength, all my wisdom, all my experience meant nothing. I could not command the river to give them back. I could not fight the water with arrows and spears. Jack felt his chest tighten with emotion. He understood that feeling of helplessness, of being powerless in the face of forces beyond your control. When my wife died in childbirth, he said slowly, I felt the same way. I'd built a ranch with my bare hands. I'd survived winters and droughts and everything this land could throw at me. But I couldn't save her. I couldn't protect her from something I couldn't even see or fight. The translator conveyed his words, and Akecheta looked at him with eyes full of shared understanding. Yes, she said simply. You know this pain. This is why I trust you. Because you understand what it means to lose everything that matters, and yet you still chose to save my sons, even though saving them could not bring back what you lost. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in memories of people who were gone. Around them, the warriors had quieted down, many of them dozing or keeping watch in rotation. The night was peaceful now, so different from the tension and fear that had marked its beginning. Tell me about your sons, Jack said eventually. What are they like when they're not being swept away by rivers? A smile crossed Akecheta's face, transforming her from fierce warrior back to proud mother. Mapi, the older one, his name means sky. He is serious and thoughtful, always watching, always learning. He will make a great leader someday if he lives long enough to grow into his potential. He thinks before he acts, which is rare in one so young. She adjusted her position slightly, careful not to wake the boys. Chatan, the younger, his name means hawk. He is like the bird he is named for, quick and daring, always ready to dive into new adventures. He makes me laugh with his curiosity and worry me with his fearlessness. Together they balance each other. Mapi keeps Chatan from being too reckless. Chatan keeps Mapi from being too cautious. They're lucky to have each other, Jack observed, and lucky to have a mother who loves them so fiercely. I would tear down the sky itself to keep them safe, Akecheta said simply, and Jack believed every word. When I thought I had lost them today, when I imagined them cold and afraid and alone or worse, I have faced many enemies in my life, Jack Morrison, but I have never known terror like that. The fear of losing a child is worse than any physical pain. She paused, then spoke again with renewed intensity. This is why what you did matters so much. You did not just save 2 lives. You saved my reason for breathing. Without my sons, I would have nothing left to fight for. I would be an empty shell, leading my people without heart or hope. You gave me back my future. You gave me back my purpose. Jack didn't know what to say to that. He'd acted on instinct, not thinking about the larger implications or the depth of what it would mean to this woman. I'm just glad I was there, he said finally. Glad I heard them crying out. Glad the rope held. Glad everything worked out the way it did. The spirits guided you to that place at that time, Akecheta said firmly. I believe this. Nothing happens by accident. We were meant to meet this way, so that we could see past the hatred and fear that divides our peoples, so that we could recognize our shared humanity. The translator worked carefully on that last part, making sure the meaning came through clearly. When Jack understood, he nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. Maybe there's a reason for all of this. I'd like to think that something good can come from so much fear and pain. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Akecheta shared more about her life and her people. She told Jack about their traditions, their beliefs, their way of seeing the world. She spoke of the importance of respecting the land, of taking only what was needed of. The days following that extraordinary night passed in a strange mixture of normalcy and wonder. Jack went back to his regular ranch work, mending fences, tending cattle, managing the endless tasks that came with frontier life. But nothing felt quite the same anymore. Every time he looked at the leather band on his wrist, he remembered the woman who'd given it to him and the promise that came with it. He was no longer just a solitary rancher. He was under the protection of the Crow Nation, connected to people he'd known for only a few hours but who'd changed his life forever. About a week after the rescue, Jack was working on repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by the flooding when he noticed something unusual. There were tracks near the edge of his property, fresh ones made by unshod horses. He followed them with his eyes and spotted something hanging from a tree branch just inside his boundary line. When he walked over to investigate, he found a leather pouch carefully tied to the branch. Inside the pouch was dried meat, prepared in the native style with herbs and smoking, and a small piece of tanned leather with symbols drawn on it. Jack couldn't read the symbols, but he understood the meaning clearly enough. This was a gift, left by Crow Scouts who were watching over his property just as Akecheta had promised. They were keeping their word. Over the following weeks, Jack found more signs of their presence. Sometimes it was tracks near his property. Sometimes it was small gifts left at his boundary markers, freshly hunted game or beautifully worked leather goods. Once he found an eagle feather tied to his fence post with a strip of decorated hide. He didn't know exactly what it meant in Crow culture, but he knew it was something significant, something valuable. He kept it carefully in his house, displayed with honor. The other settlers in the area began to notice that Jack's ranch seemed immune to the troubles plaguing everyone else. Cattle rustlers who'd been hitting other properties left his alone. When conflicts between settlers and native tribes erupted across the territory, Jack's land remained peaceful and undisturbed. Some people whispered that he'd made some kind of deal with the natives, and they weren't entirely wrong. But what they didn't understand was that it wasn't a deal. It was a bond built on respect and gratitude. A few months after the rescue, Jack was in town buying supplies when he overheard a group of men talking about organizing a militia to attack a nearby Crow camp. They were angry about some cattle that had gone missing, convinced the natives had stolen them. Jack knew that attacking innocent people because of suspicions would only lead to more violence and bloodshed. He approached the men carefully. "Before you go starting a war," he said, keeping his voice calm and reasonable, "maybe we should try to figure out what actually happened to those cattle. Could have been rustlers, could have been wolves, could have been they just wandered off." One of the men, a hothead named Bill Crawford, sneered at him. "What do you know about it, Morrison? Everyone knows you're soft on the natives. Heard you've got some kind of arrangement with them." Jack felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept it controlled. "I don't have an arrangement. I have respect. There's a difference. And I'm telling you, attacking that camp would be murder, not justice. Those are families there, women and children. Is that what you want on your conscience?" The argument went back and forth, tensions rising, until finally Jack made them an offer. "Give me 3 days. Let me track those cattle myself and see what I can find. If they were stolen by the Crow, then we'll take it to the proper authorities at the fort. But if they weren't, you'll have started a war over nothing." Reluctantly, the men agreed. Jack spent the next 2 days tracking the missing cattle, and eventually found them in a ravine about 10 miles from where they'd gone missing. They'd broken through a weak section of fence and wandered off, getting stuck in rough terrain. Not a single native person was involved. When Jack brought the cattle back and explained what had happened, Bill Crawford had the decency to look embarrassed. A massacre had been prevented simply because one man took the time to find the truth. Word of Jack's actions spread, and he gained a reputation as someone who could bridge the gap between the two communities. When disputes arose, people sometimes came to him to help mediate. He didn't always succeed. The hatred and fear ran too deep in many people, but he tried. And sometimes, just sometimes, he managed to help people see each other as human beings rather than enemies. As seasons passed and years rolled by, Jack's connection to the Crow people deepened. He learned more of their language, picking up words and phrases from the occasional visitors who stopped by his ranch. Sometimes it was warriors checking on him, making sure he was safe. Sometimes it was hunters passing through who recognized the band on his wrist and stopped to share a meal. And sometimes, as the years went on, it was Mapi and Chatan themselves. The first time they came to visit on their own, about 2 years after the rescue, Jack barely recognized them. Mapi was nearly 12 now, tall and lean, already showing signs of the man he would become. Chatan was 9, still with that spark of mischief in his eyes, but more controlled now, more aware of the world's dangers. They came with an older warrior who served as escort and translator. Through him, the boys explained that their mother had sent them to check on Jack and to continue building the relationship between their families. They stayed for 3 days, and during that time, Jack taught them about ranching while they taught him about tracking and reading signs in nature that he'd never noticed before. Moppy was particularly interested in Jack's horses. The boy had a natural way with animals, calm and patient, and Jack's most temperamental mare actually let the boy approach her when she'd kick at anyone else. "You've got a gift," Jack told him through the translator. "Your people are known for breeding the finest horses on the plains, and I can see why if they've all got your touch." Chatan was more interested in the mechanics of ranch life, how things were built and worked. He studied Jack's rope and saddle with intense focus, asking questions about how they were made and why they were designed the way they were. Jack showed him his workshop and the tools he used for leatherwork and repairs, and the boy absorbed everything like a sponge. When they left, Jack felt the same ache he'd felt when they'd ridden away that first night. They weren't his sons, would never be his sons, but they'd carved out a place in his heart anyway. He realized he'd been given a second chance at something he thought he'd lost forever, the opportunity to care for children, to teach them, and watch them grow. The visits became more frequent as the boys got older. Sometimes they came with their mother, and Jack would sit with Akacheta by his fireplace sharing stories and news about their respective communities. She told him about the growing pressures on her people, the shrinking territory, the increasing conflicts. Jack shared what he knew about the political situation with the settlers and the government, trying to give her information that might help her protect her people. When Mapi was 16, he came to Jack's ranch alone for the first time, riding with the confidence of a young warrior. He'd just completed his first major hunt and wanted to share the news with Jack. They sat on Jack's porch, and through a combination of the Crow words Jack had learned and the English Mapi had picked up over the years, they talked about life, responsibility, and the future. "My mother says I should learn from you," Mapi said, his English heavily accented but clear. "She says you know how to see people as people, not as enemies. She says this is important skill for leader." "Your mother is a wise woman," Jack replied, "and you're lucky to have her teaching you. But I'm not sure I have much wisdom to offer. I just try to treat people right and hope they do the same." "That is wisdom," Mapi insisted. "Many men, white and native, they see only hate. They see only enemy. You see, person, this makes you different. This makes you good." Jack was touched by the young man's words. "Your English has gotten really good," he said, changing the subject because the praise made him uncomfortable. "You've been practicing?" "Yes," Mapi grinned. "Mother says I must learn white man's language if I want to help my people. She says future leaders must speak both languages, understand both worlds. She says you are proof that not all white men are same, that some can be trusted, can be family." They talked long into the night, and when Mapi left the next morning, Jack felt proud of the young man he was becoming. Strong, thoughtful, willing to learn, and open-minded enough to see beyond the prejudices that plagued both their peoples. If more young people grew up like Mapi, Jack thought, maybe there was hope for peace after all. Chatan's visits were different in character. The younger brother had grown into a skilled warrior, quick and daring just as his mother had predicted. But he'd also developed a deep curiosity about how things worked and how different peoples solved similar problems. He'd ask Jack about everything from how to build a barn to how white men governed themselves. He wanted to understand the settler world, not to become part of it, but to better understand how to interact with it. As the years continued to pass, Jack aged into his 50s and then 60s. His hair turned gray, then white. His hands became more gnarled, his movements slower, but the leather band on his wrist never came off, and the Crow people never forgot their promise.